We have a good game of Commander today. Starting us off, we have Will playing Bane, Lord of Darkness. This is an aristocrat focused deck with a very high creature count. I think he's playing about 45 creatures, most of which have really good enters abilities. So he wants those creatures to die because he has a really good recursion package in the deck, so he can keep using their enters ability over and over again. His commander's job here is to make sure he can keep creatures flowing. So when his creatures die, he can either draw cards or put more creatures out to generate more value. He wants the game to go long so that he can keep accruing value faster than the rest of the table and ultimately drain us out with any one of his Blood Artist effects. Jeff is playing Tovolar, Dire Overlord. This is an aggressive, werewolf focused deck. He's trying to get his commander out along with a bunch of werewolves as fast as possible. His next step is to give them all haste. Then he wants to deal as much damage to the table as he can so that his commander can refill his hand so he can play more werewolves and do the cycle all over again. Another key piece to his strategy is to have his commander on the battlefield so that his ability can keep his werewolves transformed on their more dominant side. I'm going to be playing Loot Key to Everything. With this deck, I have a lot of cards that care about playing things from exile. I also have a lot of Land Matters cards so I can play multiple lands out of exile just in case they get stuck there. Lastly, we have David playing Disa the Restless. This is a Lurgoyf Kindred deck where he's trying to fill his graveyard up with as many different types of cards as possible so that he can make sure his Termagoyfs and Lurgoyfs are as big as they can be. He wants to use his commander to make sure any of his Goyfs that enter his graveyard come right back out into the battlefield. He's got a good amount of Powers Matters cards in the deck as well, so he can come from out of nowhere and deal a bunch of damage to the table, utilizing the benefit of having such big beefy creatures. Well, that's going to do it for the description of the decks. Let's go ahead and get into the gameplay. Will starts by playing Flooded Strand. He cracks it to fetch Raffine's Tower and pass to Jeff. Jeff plays Game Trail. He reveals a forest. Then he casts Young Wolf and pass. I'll play a tap Triome and pass. David plays Temple of Malice. Scrying 1, he leaves it on top and pass. Will plays a tapped Watery Grave and pass. Jeff plays a tapped Stomping Ground. Moving to combat, he sends 1 damage my way. Then he passes the turn. I play Urza Saga. Then I tap 2 to play Sylvan Library. During my draw step, I can draw 3 cards, but have to pay 4 life for each card I keep after the original. After that, I'll pass it over to David. He plays a forest. Then he casts Talisman of Resilience and pass. Will plays Command Tower. Then he casts Midnight Reaper. When his non-token creatures die, it deals 1 damage to him, and he draws a card. He'll pass after that. Jeff plays a forest. Then he casts his commander, Tovolar, Dire Overlord. Whenever a wolf or werewolf he controls deal combat damage to a player, he draws a card. And at the beginning of his upkeep, if he controls 3 or more wolves or werewolves, it becomes night. Then he transforms any number of human werewolves he controls. So when it enters, it becomes day. Moving to combat, he sends 1 damage at David. His commander triggers, so he draws a card and passes the turn. Starting my turn, I draw 3 from Sylvan Library. I take 8 damage because I keep all 3. Urza Saga goes from chapter 1 to 2. I'll play Yavimaya Coast. Then I cast Wild Growth, enchanting Yavimaya Coast so it taps for an additional green when I tap it for mana. After that, I cast Undergrowth Recon. It puts lands from my graveyard to my battlefield during my upkeep. After that, I pass. David plays Myriad Landscape, tapped, and pass. Because he didn't cast any spells, it becomes night. Jeff's commander transforms, and the turn goes over to Will. Will plays Orzhov Basilica, picking up his command tower. He passes from there. Jeff starts by playing Temple of Abandon. He scries 1 to the bottom. Then he casts Rhythm of the Wild. It makes his creatures uncounterable, and his non-token creatures have Riot. Moving to combat, he sends the 1/1 Young Wolf at me. He sends his 4/4 commander over at Will. Will blocks with Midnight Reaper. Jeff draws because the Young Elf connected. Then he'll pass the turn to me. Starting my turn, I draw 3 cards. This time I put 2 cards back on top. Urza Saga goes to chapter 3. I'll tap it for 1 mana before sacrificing it for Soul Ring. From there, I cast Rampaging Baloths. Then I play Fabled Passage as my land for turn. This triggers Rampaging Baloths, so I get a 4/4 beast and pass the turn. David plays Path of Ancestry, tapped. Then he sacrifices the Myriad Landscape. He searches his library for 2 swamps and put them into play, tapped. After that, he cycles Tranquil Thicket. He draws a card and passes the turn. Will plays Command Tower. Then he casts Karmic Guide. When it enters, he returns the Midnight Reaper back to play and pass. Jeff plays the Balaged Recovery, land side down tapped. Then he casts Ill-Tempered Loner on its werewolf side since it's nightbound. It enters as Howlpack Avenger. It has whenever a permanent you control is dealt damage, it deals that much damage to any target. He can also pay 2 mana to give it +2/+0 until end of turn. It'll enter with haste thanks to Rhythm of the Wild. Moving to combat, he sends the 1/1 Young Wolf at me. The 4/4 Howlpack Avenger goes to David, with Tovolar going over to Will. I take 1 damage, David takes 4 damage, and Will takes 4 damage. Jeff draws 3 cards because 3 of his wolves dealt damage. When he goes to end step, I crack Fabled Passage, I fetch a mountain into play tapped. Baloth's trigger, so I get a beast. During my upkeep, Undergrowth Recon lets me put Urza Saga into play tapped. I only keep 1 card from Sylvan Library, putting 2 back. Then I play Gruul Turf, picking up Urza Saga. I make another beast token. Then I cast my commander, Loot, key to everything. Loot says I can, at the beginning of my upkeep, exile the top X cards of my library, where X is the number of card types among other non-land permanents I control. I can play those cards this turn. Moving to combat, I send 10 damage at Jeff, unblocked, and pass the turn. David plays Smoldering Marsh. Then he casts Polygoyf. It's a Lurgoyf that has Trample and Myriad. Then he casts Maskwood Nexus. He passes his turn, and since he casts 2 spells, it becomes day and Jeff's wolves transform again. Karmic Guide has Echo, so it has to be sacrificed unless Will pays 5 mana. On death, Midnight Reaper triggers, so Will loses 1 life and draws a card. He plays an island, then he casts the One Ring. He has protection from everything until his next turn, and he can tap it to draw cards. Moving to combat, he sends 3 damage at Jeff, unblocked, and pass the turn. At the beginning of Jeff's upkeep, his commander triggers. Because he has 3 or more wolves or werewolves, it becomes night and his werewolves all transform. He casts Utopia Sprawl, so his forest also taps for red now. Then he plays Valakut Stoneforge, tapped. Moving to combat, he sends his 4/4 commander at David with no blocks. He'll draw 1 card from Tovolar and pass the turn. During my upkeep, I put Fabled Passage into play tapped with Undergrowth Recon. Baloth's has me getting another beast token. Then with Loot, I exile my top 3 cards and I can play them this turn. I cast Invasion of Ikoria, putting 2 into X and giving it to David to defend. When it enters, I search my library for Doc Orlok, Grizzled Genius. The doc discounts the spells I cast from my graveyard and exile by 2. Then I cast Bonehorde Dracosar. It has me exiling 2 cards during my upkeep and make a 3/1 Dino if I exile a land or a treasure token if I exile a non-land. Then I cast Lotus Cobra. I play the exiled Snow-Covered Mountain as my land for turn. Moving to combat, I send 3 4/4 beasts at the Invasion of Ikoria I gave to David. The battle transforms into Zilortha Apex of Ikoria, which lets me assign combat damage as though my non-human creatures aren't blocked. I'll pass from there. David plays Exotic Orchard. Then he casts Korvold, Fey-Cursed King. When Korvold enters or attacks, David has to sacrifice another permanent. And when he sacrifices things, Korvold gets a Timmy counter and he draws a card. He chooses to sacrifice his Talisman, Korvold gets a counter, and David draws a card and moves to his end step. During his end step, Will taps the One Ring to draw a card. Starting his turn, Will loses 1 life to the One Ring. Then he taps it to draw 2 cards. He plays a Plains as his land for turn. Then he casts Hour of Revelation. It destroys all non-land permanents, and the board gets wiped. Jeff's Young Wolf has Undying, so it returns with a Timmy counter. From there, Will casts Archivist of Ogma. In response to that, Jeff casts Chaos Warp, targeting Will's One Ring. Will flips into Godless Shrine, which enters untapped. Then he'll pass it over to Jeff. Jeff plays a forest. Then he casts Mayor of Avabruck. It's an anthem for humans and transforms if no spells were cast. It's an old werewolf. After that, Jeff casts Full Moon's Rise to give his werewolves +1/+0 and trample. Moving to combat, he sends the 2/2 Young Wolf at David and pass the turn to me. I start my turn by casting AC Tyrant of Gyre Strait. It lets me play extra lands and draw cards whenever I play lands. I sacrifice Fabled Passage to fetch a land. Will gains a life and draws a card from the Archivist. I get an island into play untapped. This triggers AC and I draw a card. Then I play a forest, drawing another card. Then I cast Talisman of Impulse. From there, I play Urza Saga as my additional land drop, drawing another card. Then I cast Exploration, allowing for an additional land drop. With that, I play Snow-Covered Forest, drawing a card again. Then I cast Abundant Growth on my Yavimaya Coast. I draw when it enters, and I finally pass the turn. David casts Lurgoyf. Its power is equal to the number of creatures in all graveyards, and its toughness is that plus 1. It's currently a 10/11. Then he'll cast Colony Ambush. His Lurgoyf fights my AC. AC dies, and David passes the turn. Will plays Shipwreck Marsh. Then he casts his commander, Bane, Lord of Darkness. It has the Baldur's Gate Indestructible God clause and lets him draw cards or put creatures into play whenever his creatures die, albeit at his opponent's discretion. From there, he casts Worn Soul Trader. For 1 life, he can sacrifice a creature and make a treasure token. Moving to his combat, he sends 2 unblocked damage at me and pass. Jeff casts Dolmen Gate to prevent all combat damage that would be dealt to attacking creatures he controls. Then he casts his commander, Tovolar. Moving to combat, he sends 4 damage at me with no blocks. Tovolar triggers and he draws 2 cards. From there, he'll pass it over to me. I start by casting Scoot Swarm. Then I cast Ramunap Excavator so I can play lands from my graveyard. After that, I cast The Lost and the Damned. So, whenever a land I control enters from anywhere other than my hand, or I cast spells from anywhere other than my hand, I get a spawn. I play the Fabled Passage from my graveyard, I get a spawn token, and a Scoot Swarm token. I crack the Fabled Passage, and Will draws and gains a life from Archivist. I put a Forest into play from that, I get 2 more Scoot tokens, and another spawn. I play the Fabled Passage again, that takes me up to 8 Scoots, and 3 spawns. I crack the Fabled Passage, Will draws again. I put a snow-covered island into play. That'll take me up to 16 Scoots and 4 3/3 spawns. Then I cast Omen Path Journey. I search my library for up to 5 lands and I put 1 of them into play at random during my end step. Will draws because I'm searching again. I search for Ghost Town and I get Field of the Dead. Moving to my end step, I roll to see which land enters. Field of the Dead enters tapped. I get a zombie token, another spawn token, and I go to 32 Scoot Swarm tokens. After that, the turn goes over to David. David starts his turn by casting Final Act. He chooses all modes. All creatures, planeswalkers, and battles are destroyed, and all graveyards are exiled. Will has 2 Bane triggers, choosing David to decide whether he draws a card or puts a creature into play. David chooses creature twice. Will puts Carmen Cruel Skymarcher into play. Then he also puts Chasm Skulker into play. Jeff sacrifices his Full Moon's Rise to regenerate all his werewolves, and David passes. Chasm Skulker gets a counter when Will draws his card. Will plays Exotic Orchard. Then he recasts his commander, Bane, Lord of Darkness. From there, he recasts the One Ring. Moving to combat, he sends Carmen at me and Chasm Skulker at Jeff, and we both take the damage. Then he'll pass the turn over to Jeff. Jeff plays a Forest. Then he casts Volatile Arsonist. It's a 4/4 with haste that pings creatures, players, and planeswalkers when it attacks. Moving to combat, he sends 5 damage at David and 4 damage at me. Neither of us block and we take the damage. The Arsonist triggers and I take another 1 damage. Tovolar triggers and Jeff draws 2 cards, then he'll pass it over to me. Urza Saga moves to the last chapter. I sacrifice it, triggering Will's Carmen so they get a counter and he gains a life. With Urza Saga, I get Haywire Might. Then I recast my commander, Loot, the key to everything. After that, I cast Flaming Tyrannosaurus. Whenever I cast a spell from anywhere other than my hand, it deals 3 damage to any target, and it gets a Timmy counter. When it dies, it deals damage equal to its power to each opponent. Then I'll play Bloodstained Mire. I get a zombie token. I sacrifice Bloodstained Mire to fetch for a mountain. When it enters, I get a spawn token and another zombie. I move to end step where Omen Path triggers. Ghost Town enters the battlefield tapped. I'll get another zombie token, and I get another spawn, and that ends my turn. David casts his commander, Disa the Restless. Disa reads whenever a Lurgoyf permanent card is put into his graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield, put it onto the battlefield. And whenever 1 or more creatures he controls deal combat damage to a player, he creates a Termagoyf token. Then he scries 1 card to the bottom. From there, he plays Raucous Theater. He surveils Archon of Cruelty into his graveyard. Then he casts Grim Flare. It lets him surveil 3 whenever it deals combat damage, and he passes after that. During David's end step, Will taps the One Ring to draw a card. I respond by sacrificing Haywire Might to exile the One Ring and gain 2 life. Will draws and puts a counter on Chasm Skulker. Carmen triggers, so they get another counter and Will gains a life. Will plays a Morphic Pool. Then he casts Grim Haruspex for some more card draw. Moving to combat, he sends 5 damage in the air at me with no blocks. I'll take the damage, and he passes the turn. Jeff has 3 werewolves, so it becomes night thanks to his commander's ability. He transforms all of his werewolves. He will start by casting Cursed Mirror. It enters as a copy of Dire Strain Arcanist. Moving to combat, he sends everything over to Will. He gets 2 Anarchist triggers, choosing to deal 2 damage to Grim Howrspex, 2 damage to Bane, Lord of Darkness, and 4 damage to Will's face. Bane triggers, and Will asks David, creature from hand or draw a card. David says creature, so Will puts Cathar Commando into play. Going to blocks, Will puts the Chasm Skulker in front of Tovolar, taking a total of 15 damage and getting 4 1/1 squid tokens with Island Walk. Jeff draws 3 cards because 3 wolves dealt damage. Then he plays a forest. He moves to his end step and gets a 2/2 wolf from Howlpack Alpha's ability and pass. During Jeff's end step, I'll pick up my land, Ghost Town. I exile my top 3 cards with my commander's ability. I play a land from exile. I get a spawn, and I get a zombie. Then I cast Balagad Recovery. On cast, I deal 3 damage to Will's Carmen and return Bloodstained Mire to my hand. Then I cast Wild Wasteland from exile, dealing another 3 damage to Carmen. From there, I play Bloodstained Mire. I get another zombie from that, and I pass the turn. I cast 2 spells, so it becomes day, and Jeff's werewolves transform. David casts Nyx Weaver as a little mill engine for himself. Then he casts Pyretic Rebirth. He returns Archon of Cruelty to his hand, dealing 8 damage to my Flaming Dinosaur because it's an 8 cost card. When it dies, everyone takes 7 damage. Moving to combat, he sends 7 damage at Jeff. Jeff responds by casting Hollow Hinge Overlord. Will responds to that by casting Draining Welk. When Draining Welk enters, it counters the Hollow Hinge Overlord and gets 6 Timmy counters. Jeff takes the 7 damage. David's commander triggers, making him a Tarmogoyf token. Grim Flayer triggers, and David surveils 3 cards, putting all of them into his graveyard, including a Pyrogoyf. Pyrogoyf entering the graveyard triggers Disa, so he returns it to the battlefield. Whenever Pyrogoyf or another Lurgoyf creature he controls enters, that creature deals damage equal to its power to any target. With that creature, he deals 7 damage to me, taking me down to 2 and passing the turn. Will starts by playing Bajuka Bog. He exiles my graveyard. Then he casts Cruel Celebrant. Moving to combat, he sends everything over to Jeff. Jeff blocks the Cathar Commando, taking 10 damage. Will sacrifices the Cathar Commando in response. Cruel Celebrant triggers, dealing 1 damage to everyone, taking Jeff out of the game. Will uses the Cathar Commando to destroy David's Nyx Weaver and passes the turn over to me. Due to a combination of my commander and Wild Wasteland, I exile my top 5 cards. I'll cast Terror of the Peaks from exile. I get a spawn token. When I play a creature from exile, before my triggers can resolve, Will casts Saw in Half. He targets Draining Welk to Saw in Half, triggering Cruel Celebrant and taking me out of the game. That'll give him 2 3/3 Welks, and Will passes from there. David casts Archon of Cruelty. Will has to sacrifice a creature, discard a card, and he loses 3 life. David gains 3 life and draws a card. Moving to combat, he sends everything at Will. Because his 3 blockers die, Cruel Celebrant has David losing 3 life and Will gaining 3 life. Almost forgetting the Grim Flayer trigger, he surveils all 3 to his graveyard and passes the turn. Lastly, the Lurgoyf enters from Disa's ability from combat damage, dealing 4 damage to Will. Will checks his draw to see if he can get out of this, and he doesn't draw into any answers, so he'll concede, and David takes the win this week. Hope y'all enjoyed the gameplay. Don't forget to hit the buttons down below to let me know that you're watching, and until next time, I'll see you at the table.